Hello and welcome to the On the Couch podcast, the podcast that gives you the view from the therapist's chair. I'm your host, John Dennis, a licensed professional counselor. You're listening to OTC episode 60 with Stuart Smith, author of The Well-Gardened Mind. Hello again, OTC listeners. Welcome back for another episode. And today's conversation is one focusing on the power of nature and plants and gardening. And it's, I don't know, for me, I grew up in Boy Scouts and spent a lot of time in nature, sometimes more time than I would like. And it's kind of sad because, you know, that cliche of youth is wasted on the young. I mean, I've definitely seen a lot of, you know, amazing and beautiful things and peak experiences, but I almost feel like I took it for granted. You know, I didn't really appreciate it for what it was. And especially over this past year, I think there was a big resurgence of, you know, getting outside, getting into nature, getting some fresh air. I know a lot of people were just stir crazy. I mean, just flat out sick of being inside and wanted to get out and, you know, go for walks or runs or hikes. I know there was, I mean, outdoor equipment was sold out, I think, globally. I mean, a lot of things were just back ordered. But the conversation I got to have with Sue, I really appreciated it because the work that she's done on the intersection of psychology and mental health and the emotional and physical benefits of nature and specifically gardening and working with plants and soil. It's a little bit different. It adds another element to it beyond, you know, going for a walk or going for a hike. And it's something that I haven't always done or haven't always appreciated until more recently, in terms of my wife is much more interested in plants. She loves them. She knows a lot about them and loves to spend time learning about it and figuring out, you know, how to nurse something back to health, or, you know, if there's a problem, okay, diagnosing it and sort of figuring out, you know, what works for these types of plants or, you know, in the area that we live in. And I got to be honest, a lot of times on the front end, I've been resentful because a lot of times I feel like sort of the non-hired labor, but it always works out in the end, and it's always beautiful and amazing. And now it's something that I definitely more appreciate and care about and care for. You know, spending time with her and with our kids, you know, working in the yard or in our garden, you know, if that's growing vegetables or flowers. And I don't know, it's something I think anybody can participate in. It's something anybody can do, whether that's just low level stuff, all the way up to, you know, really, really going whole hog and, you know, having a greenhouse or having, you know, a sort of a manicured garden. So yeah, it was really cool to get a chance to talk with her. I'm always just so blown away by the people that I'm able to connect to. Not so much blown away that I'm this amazing podcaster, more just I find it so cool that there's just so many amazing things out there, whether that's horticultural therapy or culinary arts therapy like Julia Ohana was doing or is doing. You know, there's just so many amazing things out there, and I just was thrilled to be able to bring this conversation to y'all. If you want to check out Sue Stuart Smith, you can find her at SueStuartSmith.com. So Stuart is the StuartSmith.com. Just a little bit about her. So she's a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, and the author of The Well-Gardened Mind. She studied English literature at the University of Cambridge before qualifying as a doctor and working in the National Health Service for a number of years. She became the lead clinician for psychotherapy in Hertfordshire. Currently, she teaches at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust in London, and she's a consultant at Doc Health, a not-for-profit psychotherapeutic consultation service for doctors. And her book, The Well-Gardened Mind, was a Sunday Times bestseller. It was listed as one of the 37 best books of 2020 by the Times. So I definitely suggest checking out the website and some of the videos. I mean, the video of the property that she and her husband live on and the garden that they have cultivated over the years is just breathtaking. So definitely do yourself a favor and go check that out. I mean, even watching a video of this garden and nature has restorative power to it. So take advantage of that. Hope you enjoy the episode. Take care. So I have on the show today Dr. Sue Stuart Smith, who is the author of The Well-Gardened Mind. So Sue, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John. I'm really pleased to join you today.
I'm super thrilled to have you on. Thank you for being generous with your time. So I hope you're doing well on your side of the pond. So it's been a pretty interesting year for you, I would imagine.
It's been a very interesting year. I mean, it's been a very difficult year for everyone, hasn't it? And,
Sure.
and an unprecedented year. But it's been a very interesting year to bring a book out that I'd been working on for 5 years, researching and writing it. And for it then to meet this time when there's been such a widespread awakening to nature and to gardens.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, it's something you've been working on quite some time and devoted much of your life to, but still must have that like, wow, this was really prescient and interesting timing that this came out.
Yeah, it feels extraordinary in some ways. And I think, what I had in mind very much when I was writing the book was that the book would be coming out about almost exactly a century after my grandfather started his horticultural rehabilitation after the First World War. So that was what I had in my mind in terms of the timing of the book.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But of course, what we're going through, it's very different to the First World War. But again, after the First World War, there was a very widespread reconnection with the land and a turning to the healing powers of gardens and gardening.
Yeah, in reading through the book, I loved just hearing the different stories and your personal connection, but also your professional connection as a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. Can you kind of give just a 30,000 foot overview of the Well-Gardened Mind?
Yes, yeah. Well, what happened is that I set about writing the book about 6 years ago. The sort of seed was planted in my mind. It happened by chance. I was asked to give a talk there's a wonderful museum in London called the Garden Museum, and the director of the museum asked my husband Tom, who's a landscape designer, and myself if we'd host a festival here. And in the run-up to that festival, he said to me, "I think you should talk about gardening and the mind, Sue." And I thought, okay, all right, yeah, I think I can do that. But I had no idea that it might turn into a book. So I wrote this short talk, and I realized as I was writing it how under the surface, I'd been gestating this somewhere, and really, because it was about the two different sides of my life coming together. my professional life on the one hand, and my home life, which, as I said, I'm married to a garden designer, and we were incredibly lucky early on in our marriage to be able to move to a barn on his parents' land and convert it, and then create a garden around it. And that was all very much led by Tom, because I knew nothing about gardening at that stage. So it was like the two sides of my life meet in this book. And it was such a sort of felt like such an enriching thing to do. I loved researching it. I found it quite difficult to sort of let the book go and push it out into the world.
Yeah, I mean, so many metaphors, just off of what you talk about in the book of the not complete control over, gardening and growing something that, like you said, it kind of started with this talk, and it sort of grew into this other thing, this other project that's taken on a life form of itself. So I think for a lot of us, we've known for a long time the benefits of nature, and being in nature, working with plants and gardening and nature itself. What do you feel are some of those main benefits that come of that?
Well, one of the things I set out to do in the book was to really try to capture the huge range of different levels on which gardening and contact with nature helps us. So right from the sort of neuroscience of it and the physiology of it, up to the more, I think, what one would call perhaps spiritual or symbolic levels, metaphorical levels. For example, working with the life cycle in the garden, and how that can help people come to terms with loss and change, and how important the renewal of nature is in sustaining us psychologically. But the science behind the effects of nature on us is really fascinating, and has become a big growth area in terms of research in the last 10 to 15 years. So there's now a really substantial body of evidence that shows that nature has quite significant anti-stress effects on us in terms of lowering heart rate and blood pressure. People who those effects actually happen within a few minutes of somebody, let's say, walking out into a garden, but actually can also be measured on simply viewing a scene, a pleasing scene of green nature, particularly. But other effects, such as a lowering of the stress hormone cortisol, which can be measured in saliva, that's been found in a whole range of different experiments to happen after about 30 minutes or so. And that's been found in people living in cities who live near green spaces when compared to people who have no green space, as well as in another experiment had people gardening in community gardens, and also community gardeners who weren't gardening but were sitting indoors in the shed on the garden, reading a book, and then they measured these effects afterwards.
The one study talked about the comparison of those receiving cognitive behavioral therapy to those that were engaging in horticulture, and the restorative effects, the healing power of that. I found that so fascinating, especially as a therapist. Yeah.
Well, I think that is an important study, because it was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, and I think it's the first research paper they ran. I think it's a couple of years ago now. I can't remember the exact date, but it was a randomized controlled trial. It involved 12 weeks of either treatment, kind of gold standard CBT treatment for stress disorders, and horticultural therapy on the other hand. And the horticultural therapy, even after 12 weeks, which isn't very long for somebody gardening, performed as well as the CBT. So there's what that says to me is, and what I heard visiting projects as well, is that for many people, actually, the effects of horticulture take much longer than that. But nevertheless, people are getting significant benefit after 12 weeks. Well, I think what we know is you need to see that sometimes the whole growing cycle through. You need to, you almost need a year in a garden really to fully get it, to understand, how nature's changing in the garden, and to see the fruits of your
Yeah,
efforts.
it was interesting. My wife and I were talking last night as I was continuing to prepare for talking with you, and just again, so many life lessons, so many connections to our mental health. And I know your story with your grandfather and your mother in terms of loss and trauma, and the way that that's played out in gardening and the life cycle of plants, and winters and summers. The one question I had was, what do you feel is the difference between the act of being in nature and the act of working in the soil and working with the plants? Is there much difference there, and what is it?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by being in nature, because I think there's a way of feeling connected to nature and closely observing nature, which happens when people are gardening, but also happens for people who tune into nature, either when they're walking in nature, or bird watching, or these very immersive kind of activities in nature all have similar benefits. I think one important difference, let's say, because there's another kind of being in nature which is about the wilderness, and I would say perhaps more about confronting one's smallness and overcoming fear, maybe, and trepidation, which is a different kind of therapeutic experience, potentially.
Yes.
What's important about the garden as a therapeutic environment is a sense of safe enclosure, kind of non, that it's a kind of still an open enclosure. You're not trapped in it. There'll be views and vistas or whatever, so you don't feel confined, but that sense of safety, that feeling that in a garden you can let your guard down, and that's extremely important for people recovering, for example, from trauma. That sense of not having to be vigilant. Hypervigilance is the hallmark of PTSD, and people can let that go. But I could talk about other differences too, because as soon as you start getting your hands in the soil, that's a particular kind of contact with nature, right down to the physical interaction with the microbiome. The old friends, as they've become known. The beneficial bacteria that are in the soil, and that gardeners have been found in one study in Australia that they had a more varied and therefore healthier gut microbiome.
Yeah.
So something that we are coming increasingly to understand, isn't it, is the importance of the microbiome and the different organisms that we co-evolved with. So gardening gives you contact with that, but it also gives you, I think, a very it's very forward-looking gardening, and it's as soon as you sow seeds, you're looking forward to the outcome. It gives you a little bit of a future, something that you can imagine, whether it's the flowers you're going to grow, or the tomatoes, or the squash plants, or and of course that effect was absolutely crucial and widely experienced at the very start of the pandemic last year, in the Northern Hemisphere anyway. It was the one little bit of future that people who had gardens, or even just sowing seeds on a windowsill, when everything else was cancelled or put on hold, or and full of anxiety, really. Simple act of sowing seeds helped people feel there was still something they could shape in their lives.
Yeah, it was interesting for us. We actually planted a little bit of a victory garden at that time, right around March. I mean, we typically have done that on our small property, but it started to become a very real thing as well with the pandemic shutting things down. And in the U.S., at points there was fear over access to produce and different things. So it almost became this. Okay, we might really need this down the road.
Yes.
In addition to
yes, it
the
was
creative.
the same in the UK. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. No, there was worry about supply chains and supermarkets, and it was very short-lived on the whole. But it didn't transpire. But I think, yes, I certainly grew more food than I've ever grown before last spring, and I will carry on now. Because we've carried on. We stored a lot of stuff over the autumn and winter, and we've been living off it very, very happily.
Nice. Yeah, it's something. We have small children, and we used to live in Virginia for a number of years, and my daughter at the time was involved in the town had it was called the New Roots Youth Garden, and so it was for teaching children the love of gardening and the work that goes into it and the planning. And like we were saying before, I think it just taught so many interesting life lessons of the planning and the hope, the excitement, and sometimes the disappointment and the destruction that you talk about a little bit. The ability to connect with tearing up the earth, or getting rid of things, weeding things. Now, on your end, are you actively engaging in the horticulture while providing therapy?
No, not in my well, I am in one way, but in my main psychotherapy practice at the moment is I've left the NHS, and I've been working for a few years now in a not-for-profit organisation linked to the British Medical Association, and it provides support for doctors suffering from stress and burnout and depression and so on. So we have been busier than ever, as you would imagine, and I, the main aspect. I mean, I certainly do encourage all my patients to really look at how much connection with nature that they can fit into their lives. But it's often not practical for them to be gardening necessarily, and sometimes they don't have a garden. But it's very, health service staff are often really nature deprived, and when they become stressed and burnt out and exhausted, they do what most of us do in that situation. They sort of retreat and lie on the couch, or spend more time in bed trying to restore themselves, but actually that sets up a vicious circle, because they're not getting sunlight, they're not getting exercise, and and they're not getting that anti-stress benefit I mentioned earlier of the connection with green nature, the sort of calming effects of that on us. So I always look at that. But in another way, yes, I am involved more directly, because what I've been doing with my husband Tom over the last couple of years is developing a homegrown project here, which is in an orchard very close to our garden, separate from, which I think is quite important. And the idea is to create a horticultural hub there for all the aspects of gardening for health and well-being. So right from primary school children to also, as I said, Tom is a designer, to sort of, encouraging designers to think about the health and mental health aspects of design and so on. So that's part of that.
Are you referring to the Surge Hill project?
Yes, that is the Surge Hill project.
Okay.
Yes, the hamlet that we live in. It's very small. It's smaller than a village. It's called Surge Hill, and it's about 20 miles north of London.
Wow. Yeah, for any listeners, I'll have the link, but just going to your website, if you just go to the SueStuartSmith.com, I watched through the video, and I watched through another one. I think it was the Open Gardens that Tom kind of walks you through the whole tour.
Yes.
It's just such an amazing space. I'll need to do a little bit more research afterwards, because I wanted to see sort of the before and after of like when you all first, got to the property and moved there versus what it looks like now.
Yes, I mean, there's a tiny bit of that. I think it's on my website. Actually, I'm thinking about it. We do have photographs at the beginning. And it really was an empty field.
Yeah.
It was, in fact, it was a cultivated field when we first came, and it took us a few years to negotiate. It was a farmer who'd been farming for quite a long time, and we had to sort of negotiate change to the tenancy just to take back a bit of the farm, and to bring it under, so that we could then prepare it to create a garden in it. And the gardens grew very slowly and organically. We were very young. We were in our late 20s when we moved here. We quite quickly had three children. So
growing in different ways.
It grew absolutely. It grew very slowly and gradually. And now we have trees that are over 30 years old, and they're wonderful. It's amazing to see them, and it's sort of grown up alongside the children, the garden.
And looking on your site, the Surge Hill project started like right after the book came out, correct? And right before?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it started. We've been planning it because to get planning permission to put a building in the orchard. What took a long time, took 2 years. So it was difficult because we're in what's called green belt. It's a protected area, but anyway, we got the planning permission and started building after Christmas. So very recently, the foundations have just gone in actually. So it's very that aspect of it's very, very in its infancy. But we created some vegetable plots, which we'd always intended to do, but we were actually going to wait until the building was up. But we did it at the start of the pandemic. We just thought we just got to go ahead and be able to offer people living. We just offered it to 30 people living in this hamlet. We offered it to families here, and we created seven plots, and they were a real bonus, actually. They became a sort of also safe place where people could chat and connect and still observe social distancing. And, we had a couple of people locally who were shielding, and it really gave them a very valuable outlet, as well as, nutritious food, homegrown food. So that was exciting that we managed to get that going. And alongside that, we'd already started working with a charity called Sunnyside Rural Trust, which has three other bases in Hertfordshire, in the county where we live. And it's a charity that works with adults, mainly young adults with learning disabilities. And it's an excellent charity. And so we'd partnered with them before the book came out, before the pandemic, and they had started growing perennial plants for a garden that Tom was designing for the Hampton Court Flower Show. And that was actually meant to happen last summer. Because of the pandemic, it was cancelled, but it's going to happen this summer.
Okay.
So we're still working with them, and they will return as soon as they can. We've been looking after some of the plants here, but they will return, and then it'll become more of a therapeutic base for them as well.
Yeah, again, in talking with my wife, who she's extremely jealous that you and I are speaking right now. I think she, given the chance, she would have like taken the microphone from me and wanted to speak with you herself, because she really enjoys gardening. I'm a lot of the manual labor. She's definitely much more of the visionary. But that idea of the gardening as the great equalizer, you can have, it doesn't matter religion or socioeconomic or race or culture or age, and if you have a community garden or a garden at a place of employment, you could have the CEO working next to somebody who's much lower down the chain, and it doesn't matter. Yeah.
I think that is a very important effect of gardens and gardening, which I heard about a lot in my research visits and interviewing people. But I think it has to be said that it does always depend on how. I think gardens lend themselves to that. But nevertheless, human beings being what they are, some community gardens can be quite exclusive. It doesn't always follow, and I do think one has to sort of watch that as well. And in terms of sort of inclusion of people from different racial backgrounds, that's not always as easy either. There are great sort of leaders in that, like Ron Finley, for example. Who that sense of of inclusion is so important, and making land and plots available. Gardening is only a leveler if people have got somewhere where they can garden, if they have the access. But you're absolutely right, and there is very interesting research that shows that when gardens are set up to be inclusive, that is an effect that seems to follow. And one of the reports, one of the sort of research studies I cite in the book about that, it was published by the John Hopkins Centre for a Livable Future, and they concluded in a study of urban farms that the effects on combating social isolation and connecting people who otherwise would not connect was the most powerful effect of urban farming. That it was consistently the strongest effect that they found, and they called it gardening as a social bridge. And it's a term I really like, because I think it is absolutely what gardening can achieve, is creating bridges between people.
Well, and let's talk about that for a second. If you don't have the access, or if you don't have the wide open, the green space, where do you suggest people start? Would that be more succulents or cactus or seedlings? Where do you typically recommend? You're listening to OTC Episode 60 with Sue Stuart Smith, author of The Well-Gardened Mind. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsor.
Would you like to talk to a counselor but can't find the time? Would you rather talk to someone from the comfort of your own home? If so, Parenting and Family Solutions is here to help. We now offer teletherapy to all clients who reside in the state of Pennsylvania. Using our secure portal, you can have a video session with your counselor using a laptop, desktop computer, or smartphone. Visit our website to learn more at www.parentfamilysolutions.com or give us a call at 717-602-5560 to see if teletherapy might be a good fit for you. Let us help you build a stronger family and a healthier you.
If you don't have the access, or if you don't have the wide open, the green space, where do you suggest people start? Would that be more succulents or cactus or seedlings? Where do you typically recommend?
I mean, I think it depends on what kind of gardening, because, there sometimes are community projects that are sort of tucked away that people don't know about, and I think that was one of the interesting things with the pandemic is many people discovered things in their neighborhood that they just didn't know existed. Even parks, for example, because they just weren't spending enough time walking around their neighborhood to discover these things. So I think it's always worth looking for that, looking to see what is there, because they often don't get much publicity. They're just quietly getting on with it. But in terms of gardening on your own, I think yes, indoor gardening. House plants, of course, have been very popular in the pandemic for that reason. The nurturing something is a very important aspect of the benefits of gardening, and you can do that indoors as well as outdoors. So yeah, seeds on a windowsill. I actually start a lot of my seedlings inside the house on various windowsills, and it's partly because it works and it's warmer, but I really relish watching them change. Throughout the day almost.
Yeah, there's something so connecting in that. For us, I would say it's still something that's done in American elementary schools. They'll often have the class go through planting seeds and watching it and kind of checking in on it, and that the hope and the excitement and some of the hypothesis and scientific method of what do you think is going to happen and when and how long is it going to take, or the comparative analysis of, well, okay, we gave these this much sunlight or this type of soil, or
Yeah, I think there's also a magic in it too. I mean, the transformation of seeds it's so counterintuitive, isn't it? This little thing that looks dried up and could almost be dead, as it were, that it has so much encoded within it that is released when you combine it with water and soil and whatever temperature it needs to germinate. And yeah, the mystery, I do think there's something about the mystery of life, the origin of life that one witnesses with seeds germinating. And I never take it for granted, because actually when you sow seeds, some of them don't always germinate, but there's always something very special about seeing them push their way up through the compost.
In your research, have you found there are certain struggles or diagnoses that lend themselves more to working with nature?
I think one of the most striking things is the great breadth of conditions and people that gardening can help. That I think actually it has something to offer, I would say, throughout the life cycle, really, as well. Because in older age, a garden, provided it's not too large and has become a burden, a garden provides a much needed sense of novelty and change and something to look forward to, that sense of a future. So that's, and I write in the book about Sigmund Freud and how important the garden was for him when he was unable to travel anymore, which because of the cancer he was suffering from was actually the last 16 years of his life. And the garden became, the various gardens of the villas that he rented each summer outside Vienna became his sort of nature in microcosm. He would spend hours in the garden and walk around it and take visitors on walks around the garden, pointing out all the things that were happening. So paying really close attention to it.
It seems so sad that our mental health system has moved away from that a lot. A lot of inpatient facilities or treatment, rehab, that used to be a very central part of the treatment was, a garden on the property. Um, and I think a lot, unfortunately, have gotten away from that. Have you seen that, or is there like a shifting back?
It's absolutely it's absolutely the case in the UK over the last, I was going to say 50 years. I think the trend away from including gardens in hospitals sort of began to happen after the Second World War, and particularly in mental health. Then with the sort of rise of what were then new and powerful medications, which have their place still and are very important, particularly in crisis, a very important part of treatment, especially when somebody is very, very ill. But it's like the environment was neglected, and when I was training, I trained in a number of different kind of settings, but some of the wards I worked on were really so depressing to be on, and beaten up, and no fresh air, just not a kind of healing environment in any way. So I think the pendulum is swinging, and that's very important. I think it's happening in the US. I think it's been happening in the UK. Certainly here, when a new hospital is being built, it now has to include a garden. And many hospitals are looking at, for example, Great Ormond Street in London, the world famous Children's Hospital, has developed several gardens for patients and for staff, and one of them is exclusively for staff, because of recognition that it can help staff help sort of mitigate burnout and just give them a much needed break in their during the day, in their lunch hour or whatever. So I think there is recognition. As always, it comes down to a question of resources. But my feeling is that a garden, I think one of the reasons, certainly in the UK, that gardens were got rid of was because the land was used for car parking, which then the hospital got revenue from. They were charging visitors to park and patients to park. So it was an awful lot of tarmac put down everywhere. But I think if you can create a kind of loop where a garden doesn't have to be a drain necessarily, if you're then the garden is being cared for and looked after by people who are benefiting from the therapeutic effects of doing that, so that it becomes a sort of circular phenomenon. Because I think gardens were seen as an unnecessary expense, you see, and an ongoing one. Accountants don't like sort of ongoing commitments, do they? Sort of year on year expenses. So I think what needs to happen is that sense of then linking up the hospital garden with perhaps community projects as well that could come in and help tend the garden.
Yeah, I remember the one story of, I think it was a prison inmate who, had this experience of growing vegetables, and gave him a sense of pride and hope. And I think throughout a lot of this, those are a lot of the coping skills that we often gravitate towards. Or I think you mentioned before, in talking about some semblance of control, of whether that's woodworking or cleaning and organizing, and just the impact that it can have for all of us, to engage in that. Even like you said, just the different levels of being in nature and being with nature.
I think what you mentioned about that, I know the passage in the book that you refer to, and I think firstly, in order to generalize it, I think in our lives today, we've become so screen based, and more so with the pandemic, and it has all sorts of great things about it, advantages to it, like I can connect with you now, but I think it's so important to have some balance, because there's no doubt that in terms of our self-esteem, our feelings of achievement, that doing something that involves our hands, where we can shape the world, as you say, it could be woodworking, it could be arts, crafts, all sorts. It could be cooking, actually, but as well as gardening, these all come into the same sort of category, really. But so important that there's something that's tangible, that's real, that we can look at and say, I did that. And actually other people might look at and say, oh, wow. And I think that effect is very, very powerful with gardening, because it's a coming together of nature's creative energy and human creative energy. So you don't have to be very experienced, to grow beautiful flowers from seed, provided you pick the right flowers,
do your research.
that are
Yes.
reliable. A sunflower, for example, they're so dependable, aren't they? Sunflowers, and they grow so fast, and they're so impressive. Or growing a great big pumpkin, that you can then share and make soup from, and that was so important, as you're explaining before, particularly in the prison setting, because what came across in those interviews that I did was that for people who really did want to change their lives, but had no belief that inside themselves that they could, and who'd never been told they'd done anything well or good, who'd fallen foul of the educational system. It's sort of very hard to see how to go about that. And when you garden, and there is that effect of looking back after a few months and thinking, goodness, actually I had a hand in that, and then you can share it. There's shared pleasure in gardening, which is such an important part of its benefits. So I think gardening builds self-belief very, very effectively. And the same for at-risk kids. I write about some of those projects in the book. The Chicago Botanic Garden, for example, runs the Windy City Youth Harvest, and it's the same kind of effect, really, of developing a belief in oneself, a kind of empowering effect of feeling, I've produced something, I've done something that's nutritious and worthwhile.
Yeah, it made me think of sort of this. Not that it wasn't a real life application before, but of Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and purpose and hope, and I've connected with a therapist in the States that she does culinary art therapy, and it made me think of this being like the precursor to that, of okay, now it's not just getting the recipe and the ingredients, like for us, when growing some of that produce, just how cool it is to think of like farm to table, of like, we did that,
Yes,
and
yes.
then the mindfulness practice of, smelling the tomato plants, or
all that, very, very, very important. And most of the projects that I visited involved sharing food at some stage of eating together, probably once a week, often not every day, but that very important ritual of coming together and creating something delicious and nutritious from produce that had been grown. And food is a great connector. And for me, cooking was actually my way into gardening. That was my way in, because I knew nothing when I married my husband, and he knew an awful lot. So I sort of followed in his footsteps for a long time, and because we were just creating a garden, and he was designing it, and there came a point, I think about 7 or 8 years after we started living in the barn, and I thought, I want my own little plot. And what I wanted to grow to begin with was culinary herbs, because you can grow such an amazing selection that you can things you can't buy. And that started me off, and then I started growing vegetables, and set up our vegetable garden at home, and that's sort of that's the side of gardening that I really I'm very, very attached to.
It made me think of another question. What has been your observation, or what are your thoughts on farmers who it's more a job, and obviously there's so much need, but do you feel they get the same benefit from the work that they do in terms of the mental health benefits, or does it change when it becomes a source of income, and there's a little bit more pressure to it?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because I think inevitably there are lots of stresses that come with working the land, and we've touched on the fact that it's never completely under our control, which is a very important aspect of it. But actually, if you depend on it for income, the pests that can kind of be so devastating, or the weather, whether it's the wind or the temperatures, can of course they threaten your livelihood. So that's then a source of stress. I think some of the benefits come from the contrast of having the garden as something that isn't associated, that is more like, that is more a creative expression, and something like adult play, that sense of the freedom to dream in the garden, to kind of, to plan, to shape something, to kind of, and to lose yourself. That feeling of flow, of losing yourself in the action, is very replenishing. I think one of the things I had to learn, and I think it's linked to your question, is that because I was working quite hard and had small children, there were times when I caught myself gardening a bit like you're describing, sort of just getting the jobs done, and that the jobs were mounting up, and that would then be another stress. And so I think it is very important to kind of pace yourself, to not take on too much. And also the other thing I learned was this to balance something between, doing on the one hand, the doing is a very important part of the benefits of gardening, but also the just to be in the garden, not to lose that sense of connection and enjoyment of the beauty around you.
Well, I imagine quite literally the stop and smell the flowers, stop and smell the roses, sort of.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. But equally, the vigorous hard work, the digging, that aspect of gardening, the exercise, the working off negative energy is also important. So it is all about balance, I think, between the two.
So I have to ask, have you created any sort of collaboration with your husband between the psychoanalysis of gardening or planning the garden? Is there any sort of Rorschach or of, okay, you're planning this says this about you, or any assessment tool?
No, yes. No, there's no, but I think we have an overlap in terms of, there's very much an overlap in how he thinks about designing a garden, and one of the psychoanalytic concepts that I draw on in the book is from Donald Winnicott, the pediatrician and psychoanalyst, and his concept of transitional space, and that sense, that a garden is physically transitional. It sits between the house and the outside world, whether that's as an urban setting or a rural setting. In a hospital garden, that sense of in between is really crucial, because the garden is neither hospital nor outside world. It's again something in between that has elements of both in it. So I know, we've had countless conversations over the years about about the importance of that. And also, I think something else that's undervalued today, which is about attachment to place. You know, I mean, attachment theory has been such an important development in psychology, psychotherapy over the last decades, really, since John Bowlby first started developing it. And you know, there's no doubt our attachments to people, our formative attachments, are kind of primary influences. But I think we have rather lost sight with the sort of growth in kind of mobile populations and people moving around much more, in the value of being able to attach to place, and that how stabilizing that can be, and actually that it really can buffer people against stress. And you know, the enormous distress people experience when they are displaced tells us that. You know, homesickness, for example.
Yeah, it made me think of, especially in American history, of settlers and the idea of, you know, you would often pack up your heirloom seeds and you would take it with you. My mother has I think it might be a fourth or fifth generation rosebush that I'm looking forward to inheriting. Not you know, I want to keep her with me as long as I possibly can, but I'm looking forward to that representing our family and taking that on.
Yes, yeah, and in that way, the plant is also transitional, isn't it? You know, as like a transitional object is, in a sense that it allows you to take that bit of home with you, or to keep the memory of the person involved alive. And yes, I think that symbolic aspect of plants and gardens is very important.
And probably the two questions I'll ask to wrap up here, some came more from the Gottman Institute and the Love Maps exercises in couples counseling. Do you have a favorite flower or favorite plant or tree, or for you is it like, oh, there's too much to choose from, I can't I can't narrow it down?
I really can't narrow it down. I'm afraid it's not
Sure.
it's not that easy. I think I do love things at different times of year. You know, I mean, I wouldn't want to be without snowdrops in winter, but you know, I equally don't want to be without the tulips when they come, because they're so colourful. And you know, then there are the Camasias that I write about in the book that have such an interesting history as well, and are so beautiful. And then on to the delphiniums, you know, that incredible blue in summer. You know, I don't know how one can choose, really. For me, a tree, you know, trees are, I think all trees are beautiful, and I don't have a particular attachment.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, or two questions that are part of the Gottman assessment in the Love Maps. And often when people have a favorite tree, it connects to memory, it connects to childhood, or things like that.
Yeah.
So I always share, for myself, it's a walnut tree, because on my grandparents' property, they had walnut trees, and I always remembered the smell of sort of the citrusy smell of the walnuts when they're dropped. And yeah, it's just always so interesting to hear people's memories or experiences with those. So thank you for at least picking some out.
Yeah, no, I but there's rather too many, as you said.
Sure. Well, variety is the spice of life, as they say. So that's good. It's also, I imagine, for you and Tom, a great exercise in communication and collaboration. It's quality time. It's, you know, all of these different love languages and shared experiences coming together, which I know you talked about in the book, in terms of sharing that with your children and passing that on and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think our project, you know, the Surge Hill project, is really does feel like that is the fruit of, you know, the fruit of the book and our relationship, because it's absolutely grown from his design practice, and as much as it has from the book, and that feels very good, actually, and it is a place where we can come together, and work at developing something that we both believe in.
Yeah, again, to any listeners, I really encourage you to take a look at the barn and the Surge Hill project. It was just so beautiful, so breathtaking, very, very jealous. So, well, Sue, thank you so much for sharing of your time and your expertise. Any projects that you're working on? Not that you need to, obviously. Like we said, the year's been pretty difficult for everybody. But anything you got in the tank?
Well, the paperback of the book is coming out soon, and it's available as an audiobook too. And I'm really the building works we've got going on, the development work for our project is taking up quite a lot of time, really, at the moment.
Sure. Yes, like I said, not that you need. You probably have your hands quite full. So, thank you for your contribution. Just all the ways that you're impacting the world with mental health and horticulture and all of those things. So, thanks again for being on.
Thank you very much for having me. I really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, same here. Take care. Well, there you go, OTC listeners. Another episode done. A huge thank you to Sue Stuart Smith for gracing me with her presence, for sharing of her time so generously. And thank you to the listeners for stopping by. So I look forward to catching you all on the next episode. In OTC episode 61, I was honored to have a conversation with Carrie Cole, who is the Director of Research for the Gottman Institute.